Okay, sorry. Okay, so I want to actually start with a footnote, if it's okay, with something we said last time, because I think you'll find it interesting. Let me just move this. Okay, yeah, that's good. I'm trying to leave that just in case people I want to see them. So there was this Mishnah. Is this disturbing me? Okay, maybe let's close it. Okay. There's this Mishnah that we saw last time, which was where are we? We're studying Talmudic Politics, but we're doing it through the lens of the second chapter of Sanhedrin. So the second chapter of Sanhedrin talks about the king and high priest. After the first chapter talks about the courts, right? That's the large picture that we've been talking about. Okay, so then we talked about king versus high priest and their relationship, and I tried to show that there's a certain pattern. And I think the Mishnah, in more than one place, not just by us, another place that we saw last time, that it juxtaposes these two figures. And it's sort of comparing these two figures, the king and high priest. And I was trying to argue that that's not entirely obvious, not shocking, but it's also not obvious. That for the Mishnah, apparently the argument I'm presenting is that there's this ideal political arrangement. The ideal political arrangement has a judiciary, and after that is a king and a high priest. And the king and high priest are both important, and they're sort of on par with each other, more or less. There might be a slight hierarchy, but they're more or less on par with one another. And one of the ways I tried to show that was that they each have a moment where they're in charge of reading the Torah in a very public recital, right? That's what we talked about last time. So the king is in charge of reading the Torah every 7th year at the Hakel ceremony, according to the rabbis. And footnote, we saw that Josephus and others thought that's not the king's role, but the rabbis see that as the king's role. Okay, so according to the rabbis, the king reads every 7th year at the gathering of Sukkot, reads the Torah, but doesn't just read the Torah. There's a procession where the king receives the Torah, reads it publicly, and then recites 8 blessings. And then we saw that also the high priest does something like this, but not every 7th year on Sukkot, but rather once a year on Yom Kippur. Once a year on Yom Kippur, the same exact thing. The high priest, through a public ceremony, receives the Torah, reads the Torah, and blesses 8 blessings at the end. Wait. By the way, these 8 blessings, just one second, the 8 blessings should remind us of the blessings after the Haftorah, right? After the Haftorah, every Shabbat, right, there are a lot of blessings. That's a little odd, that there are a lot of blessings that we recite after usually we only have, let's say the Torah, there's one blessing before and one blessing after the Torah. The Haftorah, if you ever notice, there's one blessing before and there's a series of blessings after. It's actually odd. Why are there a series of blessings? So this seems to be a link to these sources, where it talks about these public readings with a series of blessings afterwards. Just a footnote, because I know there's some, learned but also curious shul goers here. So there's a series of blessings afterwards. So let me just push for a second. Then there's a question or comment. So that's I said last time. I don't want to spend so much time on it, but there was just one thing that came up in the source that is really tangential to us. But I think it's a footnote that I think some people will enjoy. So let me just tell you the footnote. In the description here of the Torah reading of the king, right? So I'll just read a little in English. How is the procedure in connection with the portion read by the king? At the conclusion of the first day of Sukkot in the 8th year, at the end of the 7th year, there was a wooden platform in the temple court. And then this is the ceremony. And now I'm in that sort of 4th line there. The synagogue attendant takes the Torah scroll. You see where I am? Right after it says Deuteronomy 31:10. That's what I'm reading. The synagogue attendant takes the Torah scroll, hands it to the head of the synagogue. Head of synagogue hands it to the king. Deputy, he hands it to high priest. High priest hands it to the king. King stands and receives it, but reads it while sitting. Okay, and that's sort of actually an unusual thing that the king's allowed to sit in the temple. That's not really our focus right now, but maybe we'll come back to that at some point. Because usually in the temple, everybody has to stand. So this is an allowance that the king's allowed to sit. Okay, It's not like here in Shul we say, please rise, please sit, right? In the temple, priests stood. Not so easy. In the temple, you have to be standing the whole time. Here, the king was allowed to sit, although maybe he was slightly outside the temple. Anyway, that's not for our main purpose, but I just want to keep going. Then they tell a vignette. The vignette is King Agrippa stood and received it and read standing. So King Agrippa, did something, a fancy word for this is supererogatory. He went above and beyond. He was allowed to sit, but he decided to stand to show honor to the Torah. The sages praised him. Okay, so this King Agrippa, there's interesting Jewish history between the lines here. I don't want to get totally far afield to do all that history right now. But King Agrippa, who is King Agrippa, by the way? King Agrippa is very good. It is a Roman name. And he's of the last of the Jewish kings ever. There were two Agrippas. There was Agrippa the first and Agrippa the second. Actually, in a sermon that I gave on President's birthday, I talked about the birthday of King Agrippa. And that was King Agrippa the first. There was King Agrippa the first, and there was King Agrippa the second. King Agrippa the second is the last Jewish king ever, basically until Ben Gurion, if you want to call him a king, or Bibi, if you want to call him a king. But that's the last king. So these are of the very last kings. It's a debate among scholars which Agrippa is being referred to here. But we asked, did this ever even happen? At least according to this source, it happened. There was a public reading, and he did something. He read while standing. When he reached, you shall not place, I'm sorry, it's a little obstructive, but I'll read it to you. You shall not place a foreigner over you, which is a verse from Deuteronomy about that the king needs to be a Judean, a Jew, an Israelite, not a foreigner, right? So let's say the Romans want to have a king over Judah. Yeah. So according to the Bible, that's not allowed. You do not have a foreigner over you. So then, very good, like Herod. So his eyes ran with tears. Why did Agrippa cry? Exactly because of the point you're saying, Sherry, because once you start with Herod, you start having kings whose lineage is questionable. They're basically the Dumians, and they have all sorts of mixed things. They're not really Jews. Or if they're Jews, it's a complex form of Jewish identity, certainly a hyphenated Jewish identity. And apparently, this raises interesting questions about conversion and other things, but let's not get totally, sort of overwhelmed with hard questions right now. But his eyes ran with tears, and they said to him, "Fear not, Agrippus. You are our brother. You are our brother." In other words, the sages here reassured him, and they said, even though you might feel like an outsider and you might feel like there's a cloud over your monarchy, you are our brother. Okay? Now, there's more to the story because there's a parallel text, but I don't want to go there. I just want to read that. That's already interesting. Sort of this interesting moment of one of the last Judean or maybe last Judean king whose lineage was questionable. And according to this version, the sages reassure him. There's a that's a good question. Who are the sages? That was the question that was asked. I don't know who the sages are. And that's a good question. I mean, it was the same, I think, was it you're asking hard questions. Who they are exactly. Are these rabbis or not rabbis? Maybe Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai is one of the, maybe Hillel, I don't know, Hillel's a little earlier. These are good questions. But sages, we'd assume sort of late Pharisees, early sages. So I'm sorry, let me just go one more thing. I know you had a question and I say no questions and I am answering questions. I apologize. So let's not call out maybe for a second, and that way we can just get through the source. And I just wanted to show you a modern recurrence of this, which is just fascinating. Modern, by modern, I mean the early 20th century. And this is Stephen Adler, I've had occasion to quote before. He tells the following vignette. And this, I admit, is tangential for us, but I think people enjoy it. In February of 1927, the historian Joseph Klausner, who was a towering historian at the Hebrew University, right? He was sort of the father of Jewish history at the Hebrew University, right when it's founding, right? The Hebrew University was founded at around 1925. So Klausner is one of the first great Jewish historians at the Hebrew University. And by the way, he is also the uncle of the author Amos Oz. Okay, he happens to be the uncle of Amos Oz. So Klausner, the great Jewish historian, or maybe the great uncle, But he says the following: in February of 27, the historian Joseph Klausner stood before an audience at Hebrew University in Jerusalem, delivered a lecture on the Jewish character of Spinoza. Okay? As he neared the end of his talk, Klausner dropped the usual academic idiom and with great passion announced his intention to bring Spinoza, excommunicated in 1956 by the Portuguese Jewish community in Amsterdam, back into the Jewish fold. To Spinoza, the Jew, he declared the ban is nullified. In other words, this is a dramatic moment. What you have to appreciate is Jews thought of Spinoza as an outcast. And here is Klausner at one of the earliest lectures ever at Hebrew University, giving a lecture about Spinoza. And he's saying, here at Hebrew University, we're inviting Spinoza back into the fold. And we're not going to consider him alien and outcast and excommunicated. We're inviting him back to the fold. And Klausner, the professor, said, he say the ban against Spinoza is nullified. The sin of Judaism against you is removed, and your offense against her atoned for. You are our brother. You are our brother. You are our brother. Now, what's he quoting? He's quoting the Mishnah, right? So this is delivered. Klausner, Sherry, I'm sorry, just pulling out's a little hard. You are our brother. In other words, he's invoking that same language of the text of the rabbis who told Agrippa, don't feel alienated, you're one of us. And here this echoes, in 1927, where Klausner calls to Spinoza and says, you are our brother, don't feel alienated, you are one of us. It's an interesting vignette. I think some of you maybe read in the news that recently, right, the Amsterdam Jewish community said, not so fast. You're still excommunicated, Spinoza.
Well, there was someone who wanted to do some research, and the research is something murky.
Yeah.
So at first they said no, then they said yes.
Yeah.
So it's still.
There's endless debates about this stuff. But yes.
Question about this guy. Who's this guy? I mean, great historian that he is, but who's
Klausner? Why does Klausner get to end the excommunication?
Yeah, I mean, it's not his error. It's the accident. The accident.
That's a good. Okay, it's a good question. The question is, who gives Klausner the authority to end an excommunication? So you see, he doesn't have the authority. Amsterdam Jews, we're not moved by this, and 90 years later, the debate continues. Okay, it's really an aside from us. Any other comments or questions?
Yeah, just one question. When the king read the Torah,
yeah,
how much did he read? Or when the high priest read it?
Yeah, these are good questions. I don't want to get totally far afield. The Mishnah tells us what they read in certain sections. According to the Mishnah, he read parts of Deuteronomy, the king, and the priest on Yom Kippur read about Yom Kippur. But there are different traditions on this. Okay, let's get back to what I want to actually do something new, a new source. And this is a little intricate, but I'm trying to pitch this high level, but I'm trying to be clear here. So I know you guys can handle it. But let me just explain before I get off on the new aside, why I'm getting into a new aside. I'm not just trying to find the asides to get into. Now I'm getting back to our main plot. What's our main plot? Our main plot is Mishnah. Let's go back to the Mishnah for a second. Our main plot is the Mishnah and Sanhedrin, about the high priest can't judge and be judged, and the king cannot judge nor be judged, and other things. And we'll read this a little more carefully in a bit. But if you recall, the first chapter of Sanhedrin, which I've already said tonight, is about the judiciary. So one more time, I'm sorry to belabor the point, I bet it's important. This layout of Sanhedrin, chapter 1 is about the judiciary. Chapter 2 is about the high priest and king. Yeah, did everybody follow that order? And I've said this already a few times, but I'm repeating. Chapter 1, Sanhedrin, the judiciary. Chapter 2, high priest and king. And in the early lectures, I call this Article 1, judiciary, Article 2, high priest, Article 3, king, right? And part of what I was trying to argue about that, Article 1, Article 2, Article 3, is that's what emerges from Tractate Sanhedrin, and I wouldn't have necessarily known that. I wouldn't have known that from, I don't know, I open up the Bible or the Torah, I wouldn't know who's Article 1, who's Article 2, who's Article 3, you wouldn't know. And you can find other rabbinic sources where I don't think you see necessarily this design. But in the Mishnah, to me, it's very hard to miss that. Like that seems to be the layout of Sanhedrin. The tractate, chapter 1, judiciary, then high priest and the high priest relationship to the judiciary. And what's the high priest relationship to the judiciary? Judge and be judged, meaning the high priest seems to be linked to that judiciary. It's not identical with the judiciary, but the high priest could participate in the judiciary. And then, right, because he can judge. That's what it says here. I mean, I see the question mark, but I'm saying based on this source, I wouldn't have necessarily known that from elsewhere. Elsewhere, I would think he brings sacrifices and runs Yom Kippur service. But here it says he can judge and be judged. So it sounds like there's a judiciary, then there's a high priest who can participate in the judiciary. And then there's another branch, which is the king, who is independent. I'm trying to argue, don't visualize this as 1, 2, 3, but really 1, and then 2 and 3 sort of parallel. Yeah, maybe 2A, 2B, but 2A, 2B is a little confusing because at least here in the Mishnah, they're very different types of figures. So now I want to hold that arrangement of court, then high priest who has certain duties related to court, and then king who's distinct, and show how this surfaces in a very surprising other place. So you have to bear with me for a minute, please. Or by minute, I mean like 12 minutes or 15 minutes to appreciate this. Now we have to enter a world that maybe we're not so quick to enter, because it's a world of Leviticus. And the world of Leviticus, sometimes we find a little, I don't know, not so familiar. It's all about sacrifices and priests and other things. So we spend a lot of time reading the Torah, the sections of Leviticus, but usually if you're a rabbi who has to give a sermon, you have to think of how you're going to give that sermon, because it's a little less inviting to us. We don't know that world as well. So nevertheless, the truth is, if you enter into that world, there are interesting things in that world. And I think it's no coincidence that Judaism tells us to try to learn about that world. So I want to briefly learn about, without getting mired in all the details, about Leviticus chapter 4, and show you how Leviticus chapter 4 appears in the Mishnah. Okay, that's the thing that we're doing now for the next 20 minutes. And we'll see, I think, how it connects back to our theme. Okay, but in its own right, I hope it's rewarding. So what's Leviticus chapter 4 about? If you pay attention to the opening of Leviticus, the opening of Leviticus is all about different sacrifices. That's what the first 7 or so chapters are. Mandatory sacrifices, voluntary sacrifices, different types of sacrifice. One of the sacrifices is the sin offering. Okay? In Hebrew, this is the chatat. The chatat is brought when somebody sins. Now, when somebody sins, just very briefly, when somebody sins accidentally, because if you sin deliberately, then you have bigger problems, according to the Torah. You have to get punished, right? You can't just bring an offering and atone. So the idea of bringing an offering and atoning for sin is for an accidental sin. So the bishkaga, very good. That's the word in this verse, in this chapter, that you sin b'shogeg. And you sometimes have heard maybe that term shogeg. Shogeg means accidental. Now we're not exactly going to define what constitutes accidental. That's not so crucial, but we get intuitively that there's deliberately sinning versus accidentally sinning. Maybe you didn't realize there's Shabbat. Maybe you forgot for a minute Shabbat. I don't know. Maybe you didn't realize you're not allowed to do that on Shabbat. There could be all sorts of cases of accident. Now, what's interesting about Leviticus chapter 4, it's actually pretty unusual, is it doesn't just talk about an individual who sins accidentally. That's only actually at the very end. It's almost cut off in my chart here. That's number 4. Number 4 is if any person from the population sins. I'm sorry it's cut off, but the truth is it's okay for us, because that comes up at the end of Leviticus chapter 4. You see where I have the number 4? The regular individual, the lay sinner, is only at the end of Leviticus chapter 4. So who are the sinners in Leviticus chapter 4 before the lay person? So the answer is, then you want to guess, or we can look together, it's high to low. Okay, good. Well, you're explaining the order, but let's see. So the first sinner is the anointed priest. What happens if an anointed priest sins? That doesn't mean anointed priest. That language might trip us up for a second. Yeah, in Hebrew, that's called Mashiach. Exactly. Anointed is Mashiach. So the anointed priest, but we're not talking about the Messianic era. The anointed priest is another word within the context of Leviticus for the high priest. Okay, the anointed priest means the high priest. So the first type of sinner that we encounter in Leviticus 4 is the high priest who accidentally sins. The second one is, and this is a little tricky, the second one, but what's the second one? You see it? What is the second one? Who's the subject? The whole congregation. The whole congregation of Israel accidentally sins. Now, I think right away that almost evokes a practical question like, how does the whole congregation in tandem accidentally sin? That's a good question, right? The golden calf might be a nice example. I like that, actually. That's a nice suggestion.
They eat turkey on Thanksgiving, and it's not really kosher.
Or they ate turkey on Thanksgiving, and they didn't realize that you need a tradition. And okay, good. So good. People here are very clever in coming up with scenarios. The commentators were a little troubled how to understand the second case. What does it mean that? But again, the first case is that the high priest accidentally sins. The second is the entirety, the nation accidentally sins. The third case, what's the third case? The Hebrew is a term nasi, and in English it's a chieftain. But this is we have to be careful with where the English translation sometimes sort of might. You're asking a good question, but I don't know. I mean, the Sanhedrin in the Torah, I haven't met the Sanhedrin. So the Nasi is the king. I don't know. I mean, everybody's saying, what's the plain sense of what a chieftain is? Somebody said the head of a tribe, because that term is used elsewhere in the Bible, like in Numbers. Nasi is could be a head of a tribe, right? Like in the book of Numbers.
When they go through the presents that they get for.
Yeah, very good. The presents that we read on Hanukkah in the Torah reading, that every day a different Nasi brought a different sacrifice. So maybe, by the way, it's a Nasi. So there might be multiple Nasis. There might be the tribal heads. Okay, and then the fourth is an individual. So let me just summarize. Okay, because I'm moving a little fast, but I want us to get the basics.
That doesn't mean alternatively the head guy, so to speak, head secular.
Number 4,
yeah,
a person among the populace. No, any person among the populace. Number 4 is any person among the populace. So let me just sum up for a second. I just look. Does anybody have a question also from the audience? If you do, feel free to pop in. But so I'm just summarizing. We have here Leviticus 4, and Leviticus 4 has an order, a hierarchy of sinners. The hierarchy of sinners, meaning different people who could be sin, different subjects. The first one is the high priest. The second one is the collective, the nation. The third one is a nasi, a chieftain, which I think probably the simplest sense means sort of a lower level head, probably like a tribal head, although I can't be certain. And then the fourth is an individual. Now, can anybody explain? Does anyone want to take a stab at what's the logic of that sequence? Those on Zoom can't really see what slides you're on. That's not good. Okay, thank you, Phil. How do we solve that? What?
You got to share your screen.
I am screen. Phil, or somebody, can you say what screen? What you do see? One second. We see the title screen in a PowerPoint. Okay, thank you. Wait 1 second. Let me stop share and share again. Hold on.
Want to look at Freddie?
Unless there's a way you can zoom in.
One sec.
To make it smaller.
I'll get Freddie.
Any better now?
I know it's the same.
1 second.
Categories still partly hidden.
Can Phil or anybody say what you see now? not in presenter mode.
And you reduce the size of the page.
Okay, now we see the slide with the text, which you see the four, you see Leviticus 4? Okay, good. I think we're okay.
He said something
Okay,
about
good.
non-presenter
We see
mode.
Leviticus 4 and only the first line of 4. Very good. So you're seeing what we need to see. So I'm going over now outside. I'm sorry you guys didn't see before. So let me just summarize again, and you could appreciate the slide. If you don't see something, give me a message so I could see something's not working. So in Leviticus 4, it's about the sin offering, which is for an accidental sin. And the Torah presents a sequence of the different subjects who would need to bring an accidental sin offering. It begins with the high priest, then it turns to the entire people, then it turns to a chieftain, which is probably a tribal leader, and then it goes to each and every individual if they accidentally sin. Okay, that's here. Just one second. So now my question is there a logic to the sequence of Leviticus 4? Is there any logic? Does somebody want to say, why do we begin with the high priest? Does somebody want to take a stab at that? What do you think, Sharon?
Well, first of all, you've got to, let me just think something. I don't know if this would be considered a Paul the Homer or vice versa, but it seems like if you're going to really get to the people to understand that there is punishment, some kind of punishment involved in whatever they do, then where do you start? You start at the top. Listen, don't you think they'd be a little nervous about it for themselves afterwards? So it's better to start at the top, so that it can happen to anyone. That's something they accidentally do something.
Okay, so the suggestion is we start at the top, but I'm asking, why is the high priest the top, according to Leviticus 4? What do you think? Why? Any thoughts? Why is the high priest? I think your intuition's good. The high priest is the top, according to Leviticus 4. Why is the high priest the top?
He's the least likely to.
He's the least likely to sin. Why is he the least likely to sin? Because we expect the high priest to be religiously pure and religiously punctilious and religiously careful. And we're within a world, let's just together, Leviticus is a world of who's the star of Leviticus, if there's a star? Who's the religious hero of Leviticus? Who is? I don't know. Who's the religious head of Leviticus? The priest, right? Leviticus is a world of priests. Right? It's a world of temple and tabernacle and offerings. And in that world, the leader are the priests, and the lead priest is the high priest. So I'm saying internal to the logic of Leviticus, right? Maybe you're not used to thinking of it that way, but if I would ask you, who are the leaders of Genesis? I think the answer is the patriarchs and matriarchs, right? It's not priests. We don't hear about priests in Genesis, right? But in Leviticus, it's a world of priests. So in the world of priests, I think the most important Jew, in a sense, are the priests and the high priest, right? It's true, Moses plays a role. Moses is also priestly. He's from that family. But it's really Aaron, and that's a named person. But more generically, it's the priest and the high priest. So it makes sense to me that in the world of Leviticus, when we're talking about offerings, the first figure that we'll learn about is, especially if we're going to start talking about special, because it seems to be, imagine if the leader of the cult sins, right? Which is not obvious, by the way. We should step back and appreciate it's not obvious that the Torah should talk about the leader of the cult sinning, right? There's some religions we know where the leader of the cult is infallible, right? But that's not actually the take of Leviticus, which is pretty fascinating. So in Leviticus, the high priest can sin accidentally and has to atone. And by the way, we know this also on Yom Kippur, right? Because on Yom Kippur, we talk about how the high priest has to bring an atoning for himself, for his family, for the priest, and for Israel. So this is a theme in Leviticus, that even the head of the cult can sin, right? So we begin with the high priest. Let's hold off on comments just for a little bit so I could just move a little bit. Just one sec. So you start with the high priest. After high priest, you get to the totality. You get to the nation, right? And that makes some sense. In those, you have the leader, then you have the nation, then you have the tribal leader. Now, could have been it could have been maybe been reversed, maybe, but okay. There's a certain logic to that. And then you get to the individual, okay, and maybe even the tribes are subsets, maybe. So that's the basic logic. I want to just point one other thing out before we move. One other thing just in the Torah. Number 2, if you look at number 2, you see why number 2 has to come after number 1. Why does number 2 have to come after number 1? Because number 2, you begin with the leader, then you get to the total, the people. And if we see at the end of number 2, what does the Torah add? It adds a verse that the ritual, the rite, the sacrifice of number 2 of the nation, he shall carry the bull outside the camp and burn it as he burned in other words, the ritual number 2 imitates the ritual number 1, right? You see that? The ritual number 2, I know there's a little technical, but the point is it begins with the high priest, then it goes to number 2, it goes to the community. And in the community, we have that the ritual of the community simulates the ritual of the high priest. And then we get to the chieftain, and then we get to the individual. Now let's look to the rabbis. Let's look to the rabbis. So if you look in the rabbis, just one
there's a
second.
parallel elsewhere.
Let's look at the rabbis. What do the rabbis have? The rabbis have a different order. The order, I hope just everybody on the Zoom, I hope you're seeing that we switched slides to the Mishnah. Good. So the Mishnah has, this is a tractate called Horayot. Okay, this is good because tonight, if you never heard of Horayot, great, you're learning something. And if you heard of Horayot and you forgot what's in it, great, we're reviewing something. Okay, so this is all good stuff. Actually, I'm personally invested in Horayot right now because I'm trying to cram to be ready for right before Pesach to do a siyum. So Horayot is sort of known because it's like the shortest tractate in the Talmud. Okay, but it's shortest, but it ain't easy. I'll tell you that much. Horayot is hard. Sorry, they're calling out. It's a little distracting. So I'm sorry. I know it comes from a good place, but it's a little distracting. So the Horayot in the Mishnah, right? The Horayot is it's a strange tractate, right? Because what's tractate Shabbat about? It's about Sabbath. What's tractate Sachim about? Passover. What's tractate Horayot about? It's a very strange tractate. It's a short tractate. It's about Leviticus 4. That's actually what the tractate is about. The word Horayot actually doesn't mean Leviticus 4, though. What does the word Horayot mean? Horayot means rulings, like a moreh, a teacher. It's the same root. So the same word moreh, a teacher, hora'ah, a teaching, horayot, teachings. Whose teachings? So now let's look at Horayot. Horayot actually about the same, I said it's about Leviticus 4, but it's about teachings. So we're already a little confused. What? What's the link between Leviticus 4 and teachings? If you're confused, good, that means you're following. So Horayot talks about also leaders who sin. Why? Because that's Leviticus 4. So it's an entire tractate that actually is built on Leviticus 4. Leaders who sin. By the way, and I'll just say parenthetically, pretty interesting that not only that the Torah has a section about leaders who sin, but that the rabbis focus an entire tractate about leaders who mess up. Accidentally, but leaders who mess up. That in its own right is pretty interesting. I don't need, they don't need my approval, but I think that's impressive, a religion that spotlights that leaders can mess up. And here's a tractate about leaders messing up and atoning for their mess up, acknowledging and atoning their mess up. But which leaders? So what's the first leader we hear of in Tractate Horayot? The Sanhedrin, the court. The court, that's interesting. But the court, we didn't see the court in Leviticus chapter 4. So let's keep that in the back of our mind, the court, okay. Who's the second one we read about? The high priest. Who's the third? The chieftain, who's defined here as the king. Interesting. So the leadership pyramid, when the rabbis restate Leviticus 4, what does it have? It has high priest, but high priest isn't in the first place, he's in the second place. Yeah, you see that? Substitute that move, it's not a move, it's a move. It's relocated from number 1 to number 2. And then number 3 is the Nasi, the chieftain, but it's defined as the king. It's not the tribal chieftain, it's the head, the king. And who's in the number 1 position? The high court. Where apparently they get the high court from the text of Leviticus. Any guesses? It's not in the plain text, but how the rabbis somehow link it to Leviticus. Which category do the rabbis omit? Which category do they omit that was in Leviticus? The individual, you're right, is not treated here, he's treated elsewhere. That's true. The congregation. So they don't have the congregation sinning. Instead of the congregation, they have who's inside the congregation? Who's inside the congregation?
High priest.
No.
Sanhedrin.
High priest.
Sanhedrin.
The court, the Sanhedrin. Right? Wait, does everybody see this? One more time.
Yeah.
I'm reviewing. Leviticus has the following: high priest, then the congregation or the nation, then the chieftain, which is probably a tribal leader, then an individual. And what do the rabbis have? The rabbis actually say instead of a congregation, they talk about a high court. And they put that position number one. Then in the number two, they drop the high priest to number two. And then they talk about number three, the chieftain, who is in the number three place, but they refer to the chieftain as the king. Okay, so this is maybe the way we could see it more is like this. Leviticus 4 has this order: anointed priest, whole congregation, chieftain. And Mishnah and Horiot has high court, anointed priest, king. I'll come back to this in a minute, but you're seeing that. I want you to see. There's a minor thesis today and a sort of a larger point. The minor thesis today is returning to my article 1, 2, 3. You're starting to notice that here? You see this? It's article 1, 2, 3 in the Mishnah Horiot. It's pretty amazing. Number one is the judiciary, the high court. Number two is the high priest. Number three is the king. I'm talking about the right column, right? That's the right column is exactly the same sequence as Tractate Sanhedrin. Number one in the pecking order, high court. Number two in the pecking order, high priest. Number three in the pecking order, king, which is exactly the sequence of Sanhedrin and exactly the sequence of Horiot. But in Horiot, it's almost more remarkable because in Sanhedrin, there's no base biblical text. In Horiot, there is a base biblical text. The rabbis summarize the base biblical text, Leviticus 4, but they change the order. And they don't just change the order. Rather than talking about the community that messes up, they talk about the leadership of the community. The leadership of the community, as Dr. Rose said, they talk about instead of a congregation, a high court. What's the link between the high court and the congregation? Does anyone suggest? What is the link? How do we understand that substitution? How is the high court a substitute for the congregation? Like why the congregation disappear in Mishnah Horiot and replaced by the high court?
Because members of the congregation are part of the high court.
Okay, good, because the high court is 71 people. It comes from, it's the sages, it's the elders of the congregation. When the high court issues a ruling, who listens? The congregation. In other words, in the world of the rabbis, the lead institution is the court. And I think the court is the one who's speaking to the masses most.
The jury selection.
Yeah, I don't know if it's exactly jury because it's not just democratic, it's meritocratic.
But it's somewhat a elite group.
There's some, a elite group from that
The
masses.
jury select.
Right.
Let me finish, please.
Yeah.
You have to select a jury. These are the elites of the congregation in a sense.
Yeah.
It's not,
Yeah.
it's parallel. It's
And
not
sometimes we have that phrase actually, Ziknei Ha'edah, the elders of the congregation, the sages of the congregation. And it seems to be significant, it's not one just in a temple, it's 71. It's 71 from, again, I don't want to exaggerate the democratic because I think there's a sense of, the merit or the sage or the tradition.
The democratic
right.
it comes later and
Yeah.
it's somewhat influenced
Yeah.
by this kind of a hierarchy.
Exactly. And I think that's correct. So there's one other thing, and then I'll take the comment. One other thing. Okay, so go ahead. You make the comment. Go for it.
Well, basically, those are two different lists because that's talking about solely all three categories, accidents. In this case, they're really erroneous.
Okay.
So that's a big difference.
Okay, good. Sorry. So you're leading me to the next comment that I need to make. The next comment I need to make is, let's turn back to Mishnah Horiot and notice one other thing in Horiot that's basic and different than at least our plain sense. Again, I don't want to make it, I want to be a little respectful or modest. Yeah, I could say it in a less sort of modest way, but let me say it in a more modest way. I'm not saying the rabbis sort of just, just redid Leviticus. They had a tradition of how to understand Leviticus, or they interpreted Leviticus, but at the end of the day, what they're telling us about Leviticus, I think we might miss if we did a plain sense reading. And that's important to appreciate. The plain sense reading is a world of temple, a world of cult, where the head is a high priest. That's not the world that the rabbis are representing to us, either based on their tradition or how the Judaism developed in rabbinic Judaism or some combo. For them, it's a world not headed by the priest within, a cultic order. It's a world led by sages, and there is a role of truly, and even an ideal sense for the high priest, but the high priest seems to be sort of a link to the sages. I'll have more to say about that in the future. And then afterwards, there's a role for a king, which is interesting because they think a king's also important. Now, Leviticus 4 is about a sin offering for an accident. What's the accident? Presumably, the plain sense, again, we're not reading the entire Leviticus 4, but if you look, if the anointed priest who has incurred guilt, now how the anointed priest incurred guilt? I would assume that the anointed priest somehow messed up something, maybe messed up a sacrifice, maybe messed up some other religious observance, but I would assume it's a mess up in action, right? Or the next, if the whole congregation of Israel has erred, I would assume erred by doing something wrong. And so there was interesting suggestions, maybe the sin of the golden calf, maybe eating the turkey as just a colorful example, but in action. But if you look at the Mishnah talks about in a mess up of what for chapter 1, chapter 2, a mess up in a ruling. This is crucial. In other words, according to the rabbis, the error emerges from an erroneous, not action, but an erroneous verdict, an erroneous ruling, right? So it's the court that erroneously ruled. It's not whether the members of the court accidentally violated Sabbath. That's personal, right? That's their personal. We're not talking about their personal behavior. We're talking about court as a judiciary. How does a judiciary mess up? A judiciary messes up not through their actions, but through their verdict, through their ruling, through their teaching. So that's the error. In other words, I'm just saying there's another thing that happens when the rabbis identify the congregation as actually the sages and the judges and the teachers of the congregation. The error is no longer an error of action, it's an error of ruling. Okay? And that's the title of the tractate. The title of the tractate is not Leviticus 4, as the rabbis understand it. What's the title? What's the name of the tractate? Teachings, the teachers and the teachings, meaning and the fallible teachings, when they mess up with the teachings. So now let's pay attention. Who messes up through teachings? The court, that's the first one. Now, what about the high priest? How does the high priest mess up? What's his mess up according to Tractate Horiot in chapter 2? An anointed priest who makes an erroneous ruling. Do you all see that? And number 2, an anointed priest who renders a decision, right? So also the high priest rules, teaches, instructs. But when you come to the king, it's hard to, I would need to quote to you more text, but it never says the king teaches or the king rules. Rather, apparently the king's mess up is action. So something interesting has happened. The judiciary Article 1, how does Article 1 exercise its power? Through judging, through teaching, through instructing, through ruling. How does Article 2, the high priest, exercise authority here? And this maybe is the biggest surprise. Through teaching, through ruling. But how does the king exercise authority? Not through teaching, through ruling, through action. All of this reminds us of Tractate Sanhedrin. Why? Because what did Tractate Sanhedrin have? The high priest can judge. The king cannot judge. The king is not a judicial official for the rabbis. Okay, this is a lot. It's a little subtle. So let me take a minute to review everything, and then if there are any questions or comments. Again, it's sort of suggestive. Not everything's supposed to be fit perfectly. Again, I want to explain what I'm trying to do. I'm actually trying to do something a little subtle. Okay, but the subtle, I hope it has payoff because it's interesting and not obvious. What I'm trying to argue is that Tractate Sanhedrin, if you read carefully between the lines, there's a certain constitutional blueprint. I've said that before and I'm continuing to say it. And the blueprint is the leaders and introducing us in the first chapter of Sanhedrin to the judiciary, and in the next chapter, two more officials. The second official we meet is the high priest, and the high priest is actually associated with the judiciary. It doesn't mean the high priest is just another member of judiciary. High priest is also a high priest, but the high priest can judge. The high priest also has apparently a standing as a teacher, a judge. And remember, in the world of the rabbis, I think there's probably no more important authority or power than the power to interpret, to teach, to rule, to judge. So that's Article 1, the judiciary, Article 2, the high priest, who also can judge. And then the third figure we meet in Sanhedrin is the king. And the interesting thing that we're taught about the king, the first thing is he cannot judge. So there is a king. The king's important in the ideal template of Sanhedrin, but he doesn't have the capacity to judge. He apparently does other things, like what do kings do? They do politics. They do all sorts of things, but they don't do the task of judging, of teaching, of ruling. I'm saying all of that, I think that subtle design also appears in one more place. And that's why we did this detour. And it's not a place maybe we would have expected it, but it appears there. Where's the place? It's Leviticus 4, as restated by the rabbis. Was Leviticus 4 have anything to do with constitutional design? Well, actually, Leviticus 4 is an interesting chapter. It's a chapter about the sin offering, but the sin offering, not just of the lay person, that's the end of the chapter. The heart of the chapter is the sin offering by high priest, by the nation, and by the chieftain of the tribe. That's what it's about. But still, Leviticus 4 is very much within a world, I think, of temple, of cult, of cultic leaders. That's why high priest is on top within the context of a plain sense of Leviticus 4. When the rabbis restate Leviticus 4, though, they sort of realign it to their constitutional design. And what's the realignment? So let's just see it one more time. Chapter 1 begins with high court. And how does the high court mess up? Through what high courts do, through rulings. And then the surprise, how does the high priest mess up? The high priest messes up through ruling, because also high priest can rule, can teach, can judge. When it comes to the king's not a person who teaches or judges. The king acts, and the mess up is by action. But notice, by the way, how it's also inverted the order between number 1 and number 2 in the plain sense of the Torah. High priest, then the community. Here it's the communal representatives, then the high priest. And notice the end of the middle paragraph. For a decision of a high priest made for himself is like a ruling issued by the court. It's reversed. The paradigm, the lead case, is actually the high court, and the high priest is very much placed in the number 2 slot here in the rabbis. In the Torah, the high priest might be the number 1 slot. Here, the kings and the high priest is number 2 slot. So, just to summarize this, let's just see it one more time and take it in. Leviticus 4 is you have an anointed priest too, and that's why I put in parentheses. He seems to sin by accident through action in the plain sense of the Torah. The whole congregation who sins accidentally through their action. The chieftain who sins accidentally through action. That's the left column. But in the right column, you have Mishnah Harayot. Again, just to make sure when you go home or one day, soon, hopefully, you'll come across Tractate Horayot. What's that about? Oh, Tractate Horayot is about fallible leaders. Fallible leaders being responsible and would, in a world of temple, would have to bring an offering. But who are the fallible leaders in Horayot? Number one is the sages who teach the community and then trigger a mistake of the community. So it's the high court. They're the most important institution, and they mess up through their teachings. Then the number two is a high priest who messes up through teachings. And then a king who messes up not through teachings, but through action. Yes.
How do they know
How do they know
that
this?
they've messed up? Who tells them?
Oh, by the way, excellent comment. That's an excellent comment. The comment was, in case, just to repeat for those who are following on Zoom, the comment is, who tells somebody that they messed up and who holds them accountable? And in other words, sort of for the checks and balances, like who tells the high court, hey, high court, you messed up and you have to reckon? And who tells the priest and who tells the king? And that's a great question. I'm not 1,000% sure I know the answer, but I think the answer in the world of Horayot is they have to tell themselves, which maybe is a little too idyllic for our taste in the 21st century, where we're more skeptical of power. But we don't see much in the sense of checks and balances here, which is pretty sort of mature, maybe too mature. And, this is the point where the Federalist Papers, I don't think would be in agreement. They would say you need ambition, counteracting ambition, etc. You can't have. Yes.
Well, this bothers me, first of all, at least number two, for the following reason.
Yeah.
How can one person rule for himself, considering that for the high court, for example, has 71, the extra one to counterbalance to go one way or the other. Ditto perhaps with the king. Well, the king, that's another issue altogether. But how can a priest rule on himself? That's not a ruling.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't want to get so bogged down. It's a good question. It's a hard question. It's a hard question. So I'm sort of ducking a hard question. But it's a good question. Yes.
Does the Mishnah give any examples?
Not so much. Not so much. It's sort of by the way, the question that was asked for Alistair is the same. Not really. The example, it gives examples of like what would be, it gives examples, but not in the sense of that would help, I think, for, in other words, it does tell you a little bit. Like they say, it doesn't mean that they say there's no Sabbath, because that's not really a ruling that would be acceptable. It means a certain detail of Sabbath. That's the example of it. Yeah, was there another comment or question? Okay, so I want to keep it moving. So I want to now, one second, let's move a little more, and then if there's questions at the end. So I want to now get to the following point. So we saw that we saw, I don't want to, okay. Well, we saw a couple of times ago, I'll repeat just in case somebody, we all, I'm sure, need refresher, including me. So we saw that now I'm really getting back to Sanhedrin. And in Sanhedrin, I want to dig in a little bit more into the Mishnah and Sanhedrin about the high priest can judge and be judged, testify and testify against, and then perform chalitza, etc. While the king cannot judge nor be judged, cannot testify, cannot be testified against, etc. And we saw a parallel source, and the parallel source actually did not have this symmetry. That was the Tosefta. The Tosefta sort of said things a little different. The Tosefta said the high priest, if they mess up, they're treated like an ordinary person. You see the bottom line, second to last paragraph there in English. And we saw the same thing about the king. If the king violates, he's treated like an ordinary person. And so, in other words, the Tosefta, again, just to remind everybody, what's the Tosefta? What's the Mishnah? Around the year 200 CE, the rabbis gathered their traditions. And we have their gathering and collating and collecting of their traditions in the Mishnah. And then we have a parallel collection in the Tosefta. So we have a Mishnah on Sanhedrin and we have a Tosefta on Sanhedrin. By the way, we have a Mishnah on Horayot and a Tosefta on Horayot. We have a Mishnah on Shabbat, a Tosefta on Shabbat, a Mishnah on Psachim, a Tosefta on Psachim. So every tractate, we have a Mishnah and a Tosefta. In our chapter, if you look at the Mishnah, it represents the high priest and king as opposite. If you look at Tosefta, they actually both appear, but they seem to be very similar, not opposite. Okay, that's interesting that there are these alternate traditions. But what I want to do now really is try to hone in more on the Mishnah. So I want to begin actually not with the judging and testifying, because that would take more time to unpack. I want to go here. We have about, let's say, 8-10 minutes to highlight something I think remarkable about the Mishnah. Okay, and let's focus on the issue of the funeral. Okay, that the third. So let's read together, and you'll see what I mean by the funeral. I'm reading the English here of the Mishnah. I hope we also on the Zoom you see I'm on the Mishnah Sanhedrin chapter 2, 1 through 3. If there's any issue, speak now. Otherwise, I'm assuming you're with me. So or chat now. So let's see. 1 second. Let's just see that they're with us. We're good. You guys see what I have here? 1 second. You see the Mishnah Sanhedrin chapter? Can you just give me a thumbs up if you see Mishnah Sanhedrin chapter 2, 1, 3? Okay, great. So let's read together. The high priest can judge and be judged, can testify, and others can testify against. Can perform chalitza, others can perform chalitza. Let's put all that on the side. Let's go after the ellipse. If any of his near kin die, he may not follow after the bier, meaning after the coffin. Rather, when the bearers are not visible, he is visible. When they are visible, he is not visible. And he may go out with them as far as the city gate. Okay, that's according to Rabbi Meir. I want to focus on, let's leave Rabbi Judah. Leave Rabbi Judah. I want to focus on Rabbi Meir. That first opinion. So what's the first opinion say? Somebody help me. If the high priest, God forbid, loses a nuclear family member and wants to participate in the funeral, can he or can he not? We'll read it carefully. Read it carefully. I'll read it one more time. If any of his near kin die, he may not follow after the coffin. Rather, when the bearers are not visible, he is visible. When they are visible, he is not visible. He may go out with them as far as the city gate, meaning the Jerusalem city gate. So does the high priest participate in the funeral or does he not?
Yes.
The answer is he does with social distancing. I love it. He does with social distancing. That's the answer. And by the way, Rabbi Judah says, wait a second. No, Rabbi Judah, and I said we're not going to focus on Rabbi Judah, but let's just look at Rabbi Judah for a second just to appreciate Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Judah says he may not leave the temple because the verse says don't go out of the sanctuary. Okay? 1 second. Let's now look at the king. What about the king according to Mishnah Sanhedrin? So according to Mishnah Sanhedrin, let's again skip the king neither judge nor judge, not testify nor can testify against, not perform chalitza, etc. And then right after the ellipse, what does it say there towards the end? If any of his near kin die, he may not go out of the door of his palace, of his palterin. And actually here Rabbi Judah says the exact opposite. Rabbi Judah says he can. And Rabbi Judah actually has a story from the Bible that supports him, because we know that King David actually did participate in a funeral rite. Okay, so now I have, again, I don't want to focus on Rabbi Judah. I want to focus on the sort of what's called Tanakama, the first voice of the Mishnah. Because usually the first voice, not always, but often the first voice, especially some of this is an anonymous voice. In one place it says Rabbi Meir, but even there I'd have to check the manuscript. It might be presented anonymously. I think the first opinion is the more mainstream, and Rabbi Judah is sort of dissented. So let's talk about that first opinion. What does the first opinion say? A high priest can participate in a funeral, albeit with social distancing. A king cannot. And why can a king not? Because the king has to stay in his palace and can't participate in a funeral. Now, that is odd, right? This is odd, right? Why do I say it's odd? Because if I never saw the source in my life, let's say, God forbid, we had lost this Mishnah and we didn't have it, and somebody asked my opinion based on the Torah. They asked my opinion based on the Torah, my humble and apparently incorrect opinion based on the Torah. Can a high priest participate in a funeral? I would say, whoa, that sounds like very problematic. And I actually think we could support it, from verses. Look at the verses here in Leviticus 21. What are the problems with the high priest going to a funeral? There are two obvious problems with the high priest. One, I guess, obvious, and then another one maybe less obvious, but also important. What did you want to say?
He's not pure.
Yeah, the high priest, right? The entire thing about the high priest is the high priest has to bend over backwards to remain pure. Right? If there's one person in Israel who needs to be pure, because why do you need to be pure? You need to be pure when you're in the temple, right? Actually, outside the temple, you're allowed to be impure, basically. It's usually what we assume. It's only within the temple, in the world where you're offering sacrifices, where you have to be pure. And there's one person who we make all these efforts for him to be pure, and that's the high priest, right? And the high priest, that's why we have this incredible stringency about the high priest in the Torah. It's shocking, right? But you read the Torah, it says the high priest can't go to the funeral of his father. Can't go to the funeral of his mother, right? God forbid, the high priest can't go. That's an explicit verse in the Torah, Leviticus 21:11. He shall not go where there is a dead body. He shall not defile himself even for his father or his mother. That's the Leviticus 21:11. And then Leviticus 21:12 adds another issue, which in Hebrew is umin hamikdash lo yetzeh. And in English is, he shall not leave the temple. Now, you could ask the question, how literal is that? What, he can never leave? He can't take a walk? What, he has to sleep in the temple? You could have asked those questions. I'm not saying you have to be so literalist, but the verse literally says he should not leave the temple, right? So I'm saying, if you asked me, can a high priest go to a funeral? I would say, sounds like a major problem. And the Torah seems to speak pretty explicitly to why it's a problem. And there, to me, are at least two problems. One is a very high risk of getting defiled if you go to a funeral. Now, you could try to go and practice social distancing and be careful, but we know that's risky and right. And we know how much they say don't do it. Don't do it even for a nuclear member of your family. And two, the high priest is told your place is the temple, not going to even important outside affairs, even important things like funerals. That's not your place. Now, what about the Torah about a king? Does the Torah tell us anything about that a king can't go to a funeral? There's not one word in the Torah about that, for sure not. And even if you're looking to Tanakh and the entire Bible, I think you won't really find anything about that. And that makes Mishnah Sanhedrin so surprising, right? Because Mishnah Sanhedrin actually says the high priest does participate in the funeral, albeit in a regulated way of social distancing, and the king does not. And where should the king remain according to the Mishnah? In the palace. By the way, and very good. And I added here the word of the original in English here, the palterin. Has anybody ever heard of the Hebrew word palterin? Okay, if you haven't, that means you're paying attention. Very good, and we're about to finish. Why? Because the Hebrew word for
Gotta be Aramaic.
it's not Aramaic. What's palterin? It's a loan word from Greek, from Latin. It's the same word as the same root as the root for palace. Palterin is the same classical root as the root for palace. Okay? Or in the Roman, we know in Rome, there's the Palatine. Okay, these are all the same roots. And what I'm saying, when you have that word palterin, that's usually a hint, right? This is sort of, you have to become more sensitive. When the rabbis don't even have a term, it's suggestive that there's a sort of being informed by a concept that's not purely biblical. There's a sense where they're being informed by So what's happening at the end of the Mishnah? And that with this we'll pause here. That according to the Mishnah, basically not only are there Article 1, the court, and then Article 2 and 3, the priest and king, but each one also, priest and king, has a situs, has a habitat, has a domain, has an address. What's the address of the priest? That's easy, temple. And what's the address of king? So they give him an address, palterin, palace. Okay, and then amazingly, the king is regulated within the palace in a way that we wouldn't have known. So it still requires understanding. Why is the high priest told go participate in the funerals and king told not? That we haven't totally explained. I don't know if I have 100% explanation, but I do have a bit more to suggest, but I think we're out of time. So I'm stopping. If anybody has comments or questions, I'll stay. Both are online and in person. Let me just say the order for next week. We're not going to meet. People are going away, but we will continue to study. But I'm going to, instead of Sanhedrin and politics, I'm going to do a Zoom-only lecture related to Passover. That's next week, next Tuesday. And then after Passover, we'll pick up again. Okay, so let me stop the share, and if anybody has comments or questions.
Can you go back to that slide where you have the Leviticus?
Yeah, 1 second. I wanted to steal. Oscar's asking, why is David's behavior taken as exemplary? That's a good, interesting question. I hope I'll get back to that.
But who judges?
And you're right. And there is a Hebrew word that they could have used, armon, and they didn't use that word. Armon hamelach, and they didn't use that. That's interesting. That to me is further suggestive that when they're thinking about the palace, they're thinking, again, I can't prove this. This is just God. They're being informed by Roman ideas, or Greco ideas, classical ideas. But I can't totally prove that. Yeah. Now, what slide do you want me to go back to?
Leviticus, the Leviticus one.
Yeah.
And the
Yeah.
No, the one where you have 4.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now in the Hebrew,
Yeah.
Daber el b'nei Yisrael lemer nefesh ki.
Yeah, there's an introductory verse to the chapter.
So what? But that means.
I didn't translate that. You're right.
But that means an individual.
Yeah, but it seems to be there's a layout to the chapter. The opening seems to be generic, an individual, but then they specify.
Yeah.
Meaning the high priest, then all the people, then the chieftain, and then they go back to each and every individual. But you're right. That opening verse sounds like individual, but I think in the context it means. In general, generic, and now we're going to specify 4 different.
It's like that loy thing we had before. Right?
Like the which thing?
The loy, you can't do this, the double.
Oh
A
my
little
God.
bit like that. Yeah.
Oh
Okay.
my God. You know what? This is, what is it, Arasova, or whatever the Syrian, I guess it's Aleppo. And you know what? They added a page in this book. They have something that's not used at KJ.
Okay.
And and that's the one thing that
Any other questions though about
Yes.
tonight?
Well, question, but to point out, that
Yeah.
there's a parallel.
Okay.
And it's
Yeah.
not a literal parallel, but in the sense of a kind of a, if you will, a pecking order. I'm trying to look right now. It's a
Oh, okay.
parallel
Okay.
near the end of it,
Oh, okay.
where
Oh, Yevarach Beit Yisrael, Yevarach Beit Aaron.
Yeah, because it starts with the top.
That's
and it
nice.
goes
That's
down a
another-
level.
that's a
and
nice
that
example,
right
Sean.
into the individual
Yeah.
person.
Yeah.
That's always.
Psalm 117.
Sounds right.
Yeah.
Don't ask me Psalm numbers.
Or
except
Psalm
the
1,
last
it's maybe Psalm 118.
Well, that's what I was gonna look
Yeah,
up.
yeah.
Yeah, that's what I thought
Yeah,
in
yeah.
terms of that
Yeah.
kind of parallel.
Very good. You're right. That is a pecking order. So.
Sometimes.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Yeah, it is.
This
Well,
is
thanks.
delightful.
Fun.
Finally, I have a free Tuesday that I can come.
Good, good. We're excited to have you. Okay.
I mean, it's always nice to have someone. who
Good to
can
see
say
people on
something.
Zoom also.
Well, it's true. Anyway,